So you are about to buy your next Ford project car. You show up to the seller's home to inspect. They pop the hood, and you see a small block V8 stuffed between the strut towers, with "Powered by Ford" written on the valve covers. He tells you it's a Windsor 351, but how do you know? How do you know the difference between a 302 Windsor and a 351 Windsor? And furthermore, how do you know it's really not a Cleveland 302 or Cleveland 351? What's the difference between these four Ford V8 engines? Let's take a deep look into these engines so you're ready for when the time comes. Firstly, it needs to be stated that these four engines are all great old-school performance options. It just depends on your personal preference and the build you want. Secondly, you're wondering why there are two different Ford V8s with the same displacement. This is attributed to several factors, including design objectives, manufacturing locations, and performance requirements. The 351 Windsor was produced at the Windsor Engine Plant in Windsor, Ontario in Canada and introduced in 1969. It was designed to be a versatile, high-volume production engine that could be used in a wide range of vehicles, including trucks and passenger cars. Whereas the 351 Cleveland was produced at the Cleveland Engine Plant in Cleveland, Ohio in the USA and was also introduced in 1969. It was designed for high-performance applications, with a focus on better airflow and higher RPM capabilities. So, both the Windsor engines and Cleveland engines were designed to meet different needs and market segments, which is why they were developed and produced simultaneously. That's a brief backstory. Time to move forward. Get it? Move forward. Well, we'll just move on. We need to start somewhere as a base point of reference, which will be the 302 Windsor. The process will start by finding the differences between it and its big brother, the 351 Windsor. While both engines share some design similarities, they do not use the same engine block. Internally, they have different bore and stroke dimensions. Externally, the 351 Windsor has greater dimensions than the 302 Windsor. For these reasons and more, the blocks are not interchangeable. The external visual differences between them are primarily due to their different deck heights and block dimensions. Here are some key differences. Deck height. Engine deck height refers to the distance between the center line of the crankshaft and the flat surface at the top of the engine block where the cylinder head mates. The 351 Windsor has a taller deck height of approximately 9.503 inches, compared to the 302 Windsor of approximately 8.206 inches. This means the 351 block is visibly taller when looking at the engine from the front. Distributor location. On the 302 Windsor, the distributor is almost flush with the top of the block. On the 351 Windsor, the distributor mount is below the block surface where the intake sits. Intake manifold. The intake manifold for the two engines are different in size and shape due to the variations in block dimensions. Water passages. The water passages on the 302 Windsor are closer to the top of the block, while on the 351 Windsor, there is more space between the water passages and the cylinder heads. Block width. The 351 Windsor block width of approximately 21 inches is wider than the 302 Windsor block of approximately 18.75 inches. Okay, that's sorted. So the next question is, how do you know if you're looking at a Windsor 351 or Cleveland 351? The Ford Windsor 351 V8 and the Ford Cleveland 351 V8 have several external visual differences that can help you distinguish between them, such as deck height. As already stated, the Windsor 351 has a taller deck height of approximately 9.503 inches, which is taller in comparison to the Cleveland 351 of approximately 9.206 inches. Block width. The Cleveland 351 block width of approximately 24.5 inches is wider than the Windsor 351 block of approximately 21 inches. Cylinder head design. The Windsor 351 has wedge-shaped cylinder heads, while the Cleveland 351 has square-shaped cylinder heads. This difference is noticeable when looking at the engine from the front. Spark plug location. The Windsor 351 has spark plugs located on the outside of the cylinder heads, whereas the Cleveland 351 has spark plugs on the inside. Intake manifold. The Windsor 351 typically has a 2-barrel intake manifold, while the Cleveland 351 usually has a 4-barrel intake manifold. Exhaust flange. The exhaust flange on the Windsor 351 is pointed downward, while the Cleveland 351 has an exhaust flange that is more horizontal. And the bell housing pattern. The Windsor 351 uses a small block V8 bell housing pattern, while the Cleveland 351 uses a different bell housing pattern. That's done, but now we are at the anomaly, where it gets a bit more tricky. The 302 Cleveland. This engine was a Ford Australia exclusive and was essentially a D-stroke version of the 351 Cleveland V8. By reducing the stroke length, Ford Australia was able to create a 302 cubic inch engine using the same Cleveland design principles. This approach allowed them to produce a high-revving, high-performance engine with many of the benefits of the Cleveland design, such as its large port cylinder heads. This engine was not released in the USA. The confusion often arises because Ford USA used the term Boss 302 to refer to a 302 Windsor block with Cleveland-style heads. Ford Australia converted the 351 Cleveland engine into a 302 by reducing the stroke length of the engine. They simply used the same block as the 351 Cleveland but paired it with a shorter crankshaft, which reduced the stroke length from 3.50 inches to 3.00 inches. Connecting rods and pistons remained the same as they were compatible with a shorter stroke crankshaft, as with the cylinder heads as they were known for their excellent airflow and performance. This conversion allowed Ford Australia to produce a high-performance 302 engine with the same robust features as the 351 Cleveland, but with a shorter stroke for better high RPM performance. Due to the differences between the Ford Australia Cleveland 302 and the standard Cleveland 351 being almost exclusively internal, it can be very difficult to visually differentiate the two. There are sometimes subtle differences, such as a displacement normally being stamped on the engine block or heads, making it possible to identify the engine size based on these markings. Or sometimes the intake manifold could have slight variations to accommodate the different stroke lengths and performance characteristics of the two engines. For the most part, the external visual differences between the 302 Cleveland and 351 Cleveland were minimal, and they could be easily confused. The clearest and foolproof, but lengthy way to make a determination is to take the disputed engine apart and inspect the crankshaft. Failing being able to take the engine apart, many enthusiasts have devised other, unconventional ways to check. One being removing a spark plug and taking a piece of wire and dipping it into the plug hole in the head until it touches the piston. The longer the amount of wire required to reach the piston, then the longer the stroke, thus more cubic inches. For this to work, make sure the piston is at the bottom of its stroke, just as per the comparison engine, being either a 302 or 351, which raises the other additional way to make a determination, being simply conducting a full and thorough inspection of another trusted and known Cleveland 302 or 351 before inspecting the one in question. We are done. Now you have a good understanding of the differences between these four solid V8 engines. Just remember, throughout the decades of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, these engines received changes, both minor and major, to upgrade their quality as technology advanced or better design became apparent. So, this means that the information presented here may vary slightly depending on which decade and exact year any singular engine was produced, but it will still give you a great idea on where to start when identifying them. Let us know in the comments if you live on planet Earth. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe to be notified of more interesting engine info.